Britain ruled a quarter of the globe. The sun never set on the British Empire. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency for over a century. London was the financial capital of the planet, and then, in barely 3 decades, it was over. Not because of military defeat in the traditional sense. Not because of a single catastrophic event. Britain's empire collapsed because it could no longer afford to maintain it. The economic foundation crumbled, and everything built on top of it came down. This wasn't gradual decline. This was systematic dismantling driven by financial exhaustion. And if you understand the economic blueprint of how Britain fell, you'll recognize the exact same patterns playing out in America's empire right now. The cracks appeared long before the collapse became obvious. By the late 19th century, Britain was already facing a problem that every empire eventually confronts. The cost of maintaining dominance was growing faster than the wealth it generated. Britain had built a global navy that protected trade routes, colonial administrations that governed territories, and military garrisons stationed across continents. All of this was expensive, extraordinarily expensive. And it was only sustainable as long as the empire generated more wealth than it consumed. For decades, it did. The colonies provided raw materials cheaply. India alone contributed enormous wealth through taxation, resource extraction, and forced trade arrangements. British manufactured goods were exported across the empire, creating markets that competitors couldn't access. The system worked as long as Britain maintained industrial supremacy and could enforce the rules. But both of those advantages were eroding by 1900. The first killer was competition. Germany and the United States were industrializing rapidly, producing goods as good as Britain's, but cheaper. They weren't burdened by the costs of maintaining a global empire. They could undercut British prices and steal market share. Meanwhile, the colonies were becoming more expensive to administer and defend. Nationalist movements required military suppression. Infrastructure required investment. The return on imperial investment was declining while the costs kept rising. World War I was the first mortal wound. Britain financed the war by borrowing heavily, primarily from the United States. By 1918, Britain had gone from being the world's largest creditor nation to being deeply in debt. The pound, which had been backed by gold and British economic dominance, was now backed partly by debt and promises. The financial cost was staggering. Britain had spent roughly 40% of its national wealth on the war. That wealth didn't come back. It was destroyed in the trenches of France and Belgium. But Britain still maintained the appearance of empire. The colonies remained. The pound was still reserve currency. The Royal Navy still ruled the seas. On the surface, everything looked intact. This is crucial to understand. Imperial decline isn't always visible. The British Empire looked powerful in 1920, even though the economic foundation was already shattered. The appearance of power can persist long after the reality has evaporated. World War II was the death blow. Britain entered the war already weakened from the first conflict and the Depression. 6 years of total war consumed what remained of British economic strength. The cost was apocalyptic. Britain was fighting on multiple fronts, defending territories across the globe, while being bombed at home. To fund this, Britain borrowed massively from the United States under the Lend-Lease program. By 1945, Britain owed America approximately $21 billion in present-day terms, plus another $3 billion to Canada. Here's where the empire's economic logic broke down completely. Britain was bankrupted by the war, but it still controlled colonies that were demanding independence. Defending those colonies required military force that Britain could no longer afford. Administering them required investment that Britain couldn't make. The empire had become a net drain. Every pound spent maintaining control in India, Malaya, Egypt, or elsewhere was a pound that Britain desperately needed at home to rebuild bombed cities and restart its economy. The pound sterling's collapse as reserve currency sealed the empire's fate. In 1944, at Bretton Woods, the global financial order was restructured with the dollar, not the pound, as the primary reserve currency. This was an explicit acknowledgement that America had replaced Britain as the dominant economic power. For Britain, this was catastrophic. Reserve currency status had allowed Britain to run deficits and borrow cheaply because the world needed pounds. Without that privilege, Britain faced the constraints that normal countries face. And Britain couldn't afford to be a normal country while maintaining a global empire. The financial crisis came in 1947. Britain was broke. The loans from America were running out. The economy was shattered. And there was no way to maintain the empire without money. India, the crown jewel, was becoming independent, partly because Britain literally couldn't afford to keep it. The cost of suppressing independence movements, administering the territory, and defending it against external threats exceeded any benefit Britain was extracting. India became independent in 1947 not primarily because of moral awakening, but because of economic exhaustion. This triggered a cascade. Once India left, the strategic and economic logic of the empire unraveled. Other colonies demanded independence. Britain lacked the resources to deny them. Within 2 decades, most of the empire was gone. By 1970, Britain was just another European nation, no longer a superpower. The transformation took barely 25 years. An empire built over centuries disappeared in a generation. The domestic economic consequences were severe and long-lasting. Britain went from being the world's financial center to a country plagued by inflation, strikes, and stagnation. The pound was devalued multiple times. Living standards, which had been among the highest in the world, were surpassed by Germany, France, and other countries that didn't bear the cost of empire. The 1970s saw Britain go hat in hand to the International Monetary Fund for a bailout. A country that had ruled the world was asking for emergency loans just to keep functioning. This is the economic blueprint of imperial collapse. First, the costs of maintaining empire grow faster than the wealth it generates. Second, war or crisis accelerates this imbalance catastrophically. Third, debt replaces wealth as the foundation of power. Fourth, loss of reserve currency status removes the ability to borrow cheaply. Fifth, the empire becomes economically unsustainable and dismantles rapidly. Sixth, decades of relative decline follow as the country adjusts to being ordinary rather than exceptional. Now apply this blueprint to America. The United States maintains military bases in over 70 countries. It spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. It's been at war continuously for over 2 decades in the Middle East. The costs are staggering. Meanwhile, China is industrializing and competing in ways that mirror Germany's challenge to Britain in 1900. America is manufacturing. Base has been hollowed out. The trade deficit is structural and enormous. America finances this through debt, just as Britain did. The national debt exceeds $33 trillion. The only reason this is manageable is reserve currency status, the same advantage Britain had and then lost. Foreign countries hold dollars and treasury bonds because they need dollars for international trade. This allows America to borrow at rates that would cripple other nations. But reserve currency status isn't permanent. It's contingent on economic dominance and credibility. Both are being tested. The parallels are precise and uncomfortable. Like Britain before World War I, America appears powerful, but is financially overextended. Like Britain after World War I, America is increasingly dependent on debt to maintain its position. Like Britain after World War II, America may discover that maintaining a global empire is simply too expensive for even a wealthy nation to afford indefinitely. The mechanisms are identical. Only the timeline is different. Britain's elite saw the collapse coming but couldn't stop it. The financial logic was inexorable. They could have ended the empire gradually and managed the decline, but political incentives pushed toward maintaining appearances until the system broke. American elites faced the same incentives. Admitting that the empire is unsustainable would be political suicide, so the spending continues, the debt grows, the structural problems worsen. This is how empires fall, not through sudden defeat, but through financial exhaustion that becomes undeniable only after it's too late to manage gracefully. For individuals, Britain's collapse offers clear lessons. The people who maintained wealth through Britain's decline were those who diversified internationally, who moved assets abroad, who recognized that British supremacy was ending and positioned accordingly. Those who kept everything in pounds, who trusted in imperial permanence, who believed that Britain's status was eternal, they lost purchasing power for decades. Their savings were eroded by devaluation and inflation. They discovered too late that empires don't protect their citizens when the empire itself is failing. Britain went from ruling the world to borrowing from the IMF in 60 years. From the pound as reserve currency to the pound as just another currency in 50 years. From empire to ordinary nation in 30 years. The speed of this collapse shocked contemporaries. But the economic logic was clear throughout. Cost exceeded the benefit. The debt exceeded the ability to repay. The empire became a burden rather than an asset. And once that happened, collapse wasn't a possibility. It was a countdown. America is somewhere on that same timeline. The costs are rising. The debt is accumulating. The competition is intensifying. Reserve currency status is being challenged. The blueprint Britain followed is the blueprint America is following. The question isn't whether economic logic applies to America. The question is how much time remains before the logic becomes undeniable and the adjustment begins. If this changed how you see America's trajectory, subscribe. The blueprint is clear. The pattern is established. The only uncertainty is timing. Time is running out.